It began with a cough, a single human sound lost in the wind that swept across the plains of Kansas. A cough from an army cook named Albert Gitchell in Camp Funston, Fort Riley. On the morning of March 4th, 1918, he reported to the infirmary with a sore throat and a fever. The camp doctors assumed it was a routine case of influenza. By noon, more than 100 soldiers stood in line behind him, shivering, sweating, gasping for air. No one could have known that this was the first spark of the deadliest pandemic in modern history, a pandemic that would kill more people than the First World War itself. Camp Funston was a hive of war preparation. 30,000 men trained to cross the ocean and fight in Europe. They lived shoulder to shoulder, slept in barracks thick with tobacco smoke and dust, and shared the same mess halls, latrines and laughter. When the first soldiers began collapsing during drills, no one sounded the alarm. The war consumed everything, including the attention of doctors. "It is only influenza," one medical officer wrote. "They will recover soon." But influenza this time was something else entirely. Within a week, 1,100 soldiers were hospitalized. Dozens were dead. The military quarantined the camp, but did not stop troop movement. Men continued to travel east, boarding crowded trains to other camps, Camp Oglethorpe, Camp Devons, Camp Hancock, carrying the invisible enemy in their lungs. From there, they sailed for France, crammed into transport ships like cattle. Each breath became a weapon. The virus, unknown and unseen, traveled the world faster than any army. Across the Atlantic, the trenches of France were already filled with mud, rats, and death. The Great War had turned the landscape into a mechanical slaughterhouse. In this world of gas and decay, a cough drew no attention. Men coughed constantly, from cold, from mustard gas, from exhaustion. So when soldiers began falling ill, no one suspected anything extraordinary. "It passes quickly," said the medics. 3 days of fever. But soon, the bodies of young, strong soldiers turned black from lack of oxygen, their lungs filled with fluid until they drowned in their own blood. The doctors had no name for it. They had no tools, no treatment, and no understanding. Influenza had always been a familiar visitor, cruel but predictable. It struck the weak, the old, the very young. But this new strain, whatever it was, broke every rule. It attacked the healthiest first. Men in their 20s, the very image of vitality, died in hours. It was as if the disease fed on strength itself. One British doctor, horrified, wrote, "It is a plague that prefers the strong. The more vigorous the patient, the quicker he falls." In the spring of 1918, the epidemic seemed to come and go in waves. In France, Britain, India, China, and the United States, hospitals filled briefly, then emptied again. The illness spread quietly through ports and military convoys. It slipped into factories, schools, and families, a traveler without a passport. Newspapers mentioned it in small columns. An epidemic of influenza among troops. No cause for alarm. Governments censored what they knew, afraid to lower morale. The war demanded silence. Death by infection was not a patriotic story. Only Spain, neutral and uncensored, reported the truth. Madrid newspapers described the strange malady sweeping through the capital. Even the young King Alfonso III fell ill, but survived. Because Spanish journalists dared to print the news, the world would forever blame their country. It became La Gripe Española, the Spanish flu. Spain had not created it. Spain had merely told the truth. Summer came. The first wave subsided. The war raged on. And for a moment it seemed as if the sickness had retreated. Soldiers returned to training. Civilians returned to work. Medical reports softened. Influenza, while severe in isolated cases, appears to be declining. The world exhaled. No one realized that the virus had not disappeared. It had evolved. Like a patient predator, it was waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. In hospitals from Boston to Bombay, a few physicians kept uneasy notes. They observed that the disease spread unusually fast and caused cyanosis, a bluish discoloration of the skin. Some victims turned so dark that nurses mistook them for strangers. The lungs upon autopsy were heavy, swollen, filled with a thick, bloody froth. "They look as if the men have drowned," one surgeon wrote. The descriptions were eerily identical across continents. The doctors, separated by oceans, were describing the same nightmare without realizing it. The science of 1918 was blind. The concept of a virus existed, but no one had seen one. Microscopes were too weak. Influenza remained a mystery wrapped in superstition. Treatments ranged from whiskey to morphine to turpentine. Some doctors prescribed bleeding. Others, desperate, stuffed cotton up patients' noses or burned sulfur in sick rooms. Nothing worked. The death rate among soldiers spiked. Hospitals ran out of beds, morphine and coffins. At Camp Devens near Boston, the Army's chief pathologist, Colonel Victor Vaughan, wrote in his diary, "It is as if the Blue Death had returned. One day they are perfectly well, the next they are dying. The faces turn mahogany, the lungs fill until they spill blood from the mouth and nose. The morgue is overflowing, there are no coffins left." Still, officials insisted it was just influenza. The war machine could not stop. In cities, the sickness moved invisibly. Trains carried it east, ships carried it west. From America to Africa, from London to Lagos, it rode on the breath of strangers. In the slums of Bombay, the Ganges carried away corpses by the thousands. In the frozen villages of Alaska, entire communities vanished. Every inhabitant dead within a week. The Eskimo dogs went feral, feeding on the bodies. In Persia, so many died that villages ceased to exist, their names forgotten. But in the summer of 1918, the worst was still to come. The world stood at the edge of the abyss without knowing it. Back in Kansas, farmers noticed their neighbors coughing again. In Philadelphia, rumors of a returning fever began to spread. In French camps, doctors observed the virus becoming faster, deadlier. Something inside it had changed. A mutation triggered by the crowded, feverish cauldron of war. The pathogen had learned to kill efficiently, and yet humanity went on with its business. Governments issued victory posters and war bonds. Armies prepared for one last offensive. Soldiers marched shoulder to shoulder through the mud, singing. They had no idea that every breath they shared carried death. By late August, ships leaving the port of Brest carried more than troops. They carried contagion. The virus had hitched a ride across the globe. It traveled to Boston, then to New York, then to Cape Town, Rio, and Shanghai. It entered the bloodstream of civilization itself. In Boston's Commonwealth Pier, dock workers unloaded cargo from the Navy vessel USS Leviathan. Within days, half the crew was sick. Within weeks, the hospitals overflowed. The disease was faster now, more aggressive. Doctors called it the gripper, but this was no mere influenza. They began to whisper about a new plague. Still, newspapers remained silent. The war censors forbade panic. In September, as the leaves began to fall, the virus made its final transformation. What had been a whisper became a scream. Philadelphia planned a massive parade, the Liberty Loan Parade, to sell war bonds. Against the advice of a few worried physicians, the city went ahead. 200,000 people filled the streets, laughing, shouting, breathing in one another's faces. The next morning, the hospitals began to fill. Within 3 days, every bed was taken. Within a week, the dead lay in their homes for days, waiting for space in the morgue. But that is the next chapter, the beginning of the storm itself. For now, in the spring and summer of 1918, the world stood in a fragile calm. People danced in the streets, wrote letters home, sang songs of victory. The war seemed nearly won. The soldiers dreamed of peace. No one knew that death had already crossed the oceans, learned their languages, and waited patiently in their lungs. The whisper had begun. The storm was coming. By the summer of 1918, the war was beginning to fade, but the virus was gaining strength. It traveled silently with the soldiers who filled the trains, the ships, and the ports. They believed they were fighting for their nations, but they were carrying an enemy that belonged to no flag. From the ports of Brest and Liverpool to Boston and Rio de Janeiro, the infection moved faster than any news report. Wherever the war went, it followed. It had no sound, no shape, no mercy. At the beginning of August, the American troop ship Leviathan arrived in New York with thousands of men from France. Many were already weak from fever. Within days of docking, they collapsed on the piers and in the streets. Doctors rushed to treat them, believing it was the same mild influenza that had struck in the spring. But this time, the sickness moved like fire through dry grass. By the end of the week, hospitals near the harbor were full, and the Navy declared an emergency. Yet the ships kept sailing, the trains kept running, and the crowds kept working. Across the Atlantic, in the trenches of France, the soldiers noticed the same thing. Men fell ill in the morning and were gone by nightfall. Commanders thought it was poison gas. Nurses worked until they fainted, wrapping bandages around faces they would never remember. In the chaos of war, the sickness was only another form of death. Messages from the front described a wind that passes through the camp, leaving silence behind. By September, the infection had reached the great cities. London tried to hide it. New York ignored it. Bombay and Cape Town did not have the choice. Markets closed, trams slowed, and fear began to fill the empty spaces between people. Families hung wet sheets over doors, believing the damp air might trap the disease. Pharmacists sold anything that could be swallowed, rubbed, or burned. Garlic, vinegar, camphor, whiskey, all promised protection. Nothing worked. The virus spread most quickly where people gathered to celebrate. In Philadelphia, officials planned the Liberty Loan Parade to raise money for the war. Despite warnings from a few doctors, the mayor refused to cancel. 200,000 people filled the streets, cheering the marching bands. 3 days later, every hospital bed in the city was taken. Within a week, the undertakers stopped answering their doors. The newspapers changed tone overnight, but by then it was too late. The same pattern unfolded everywhere. In Boston, the streetcars ran empty as drivers died at the wheel. In Rio, the churches were filled not with prayers but with the sick, lying side by side on the floors. In London, the sound of coughing echoed through the underground. In New Zealand, ships arriving from Europe brought the disease to islands that had never known it. Even in Alaska, isolated villages received the infection from a single mailboat. There was nowhere left untouched. Doctors were unprepared for what they saw. They spoke of lungs that seemed to drown from within, of fevers that burned so quickly. The skin turned cold afterward. They sent cables to one another, comparing notes, searching for a cure. Some blamed dust, others electricity, or the alignment of planets. A few began to suspect that the agent was too small to see, but microscopes could not yet reveal it. The best hospitals in the world were powerless against something invisible. Governments, afraid of panic, continued to minimize the danger. Newspapers printed cautious optimism. The disease is under control, they wrote, while funeral processions stretched for blocks. Censors struck out words like plague and epidemic from medical reports. The war still demanded victory parades and headlines about heroism. The truth was buried beneath slogans. By October, the sickness had circled the world. In India, railway stations became morgues. Bodies lay on the platforms waiting for trains that would never arrive. In Japan, the emperor's court closed its gates. In Berlin, the armistice negotiations continued under the shadow of illness. And in America, cities issued new laws overnight. No public gatherings, no theaters, no church services, no handshakes. People wore gauze masks that offered little protection, but gave them the illusion of control. The masks became a new uniform. In some towns, they were mandatory. In others, a mark of fear. Photographs from the period show policemen directing traffic, with faces wrapped in fabric, brides wearing veils of white gauze, and children staring at the camera through strips of cloth. The world looked as if it had forgotten how to breathe. In hospitals, the nurses were the first to fall. They worked, without rest, feeding and cleaning the sick, sleeping in corridors when they could. Many died where they stood. Volunteers replaced them, ordinary citizens who had never touched a patient before. They too became ill. Still, they came. Teachers, students, priests, even prisoners released to dig graves. It was the first time in living memory that humanity fought the same enemy together, yet it was a war without weapons. The medical journals of late 1918 read like dispatches from a collapsing civilization. Doctors wrote in restrained language, but between the lines was despair. They described the illness as explosive, unprecedented, malignant. They recorded how quickly it moved through military camps, how entire households disappeared in a single week. They noted that it struck hardest at those in the prime of life, young adults between 20 and 40, and they could not explain why. By November, when the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the cheering crowds met not peace but contagion. Soldiers returning home brought with them more than medals. The same trains that carried victory banners also carried the fever into every small town. The homecoming became a second wave. Church bells rang for the end of the war, and at the same moment, funeral bells rang for the dead. People celebrated in the streets wearing masks, embracing one another in defiance, whispering that the sickness would soon pass. They did not know that the virus was still moving, still searching. From continent to continent it drifted, unseen, unstoppable. It crossed deserts and oceans, passing from hand to hand, from mother to child. There was no army capable of halting. No treaty that could command it to stop. The world had fought its greatest war and was now losing to something smaller than a breath. By the end of 1918, 1 in every 4 people on Earth had been touched by the invisible enemy. Governments no longer hid the truth. They simply could not. Entire economies froze, cities emptied, and the sound of mourning became a constant rhythm of daily life. Doctors stopped counting. Priests stopped recording names. Newspapers printed lists that filled entire pages. When winter arrived, the epidemic reached its height. The cold air seemed to feed it, carrying it deeper into homes, deeper into lungs. In the north and south alike, people waited for spring with the same prayer, that the sickness would burn itself out. There were no new parades now. No speeches about glory, only the faint hope that survival itself was enough. And through it all, the virus continued its journey, unseen but everywhere, reminding humanity that the smallest things in the world can sometimes be the most powerful. The War of Nations was ending, but the war against the invisible had only begun. By the autumn of 1918, the world no longer needed news to know that something was wrong. The silence itself had changed. Streets that once echoed with wagons and laughter now carried the sound of bells, and the bells rang all day. People counted, time not by calendars, but by funerals. The war in Europe was nearly over, yet the peace everyone had prayed for felt like another illusion. The second wave of the influenza had arrived, sharper and faster than anyone imagined possible. In September, it struck Boston, Philadelphia, and Brest. In October, it was everywhere. The virus no longer spared anyone. It moved through ships, schools, and mines as if guided by intention. In some cities, it seemed to come with the morning fog. By night, it had taken 1,000 lives. Philadelphia became the warning. The Liberty Loan Parade had turned the city into a festival, and within a week, the festival became a graveyard. Hospitals closed their doors. Doctors treated patients in hallways, in churches, in the streets. The Board of Health banned public gatherings, but it was too late. Coffins were stacked outside undertakers' offices, and families nailed windows, shut in desperate hope that the sickness would stay outside. Volunteers drove wagons through neighborhoods calling for the living to bring out their dead. Elsewhere, the same scenes unfolded with different accents. In Glasgow, the trams carried only silence. In Madrid, the people wore black cloth over their faces and burned incense in the squares. In Calcutta, the burning ghats along the river glowed through the night, endless fires feeding on the losses of the day. The pandemic had no center anymore. It was everywhere at once. Medical science was overwhelmed. Laboratories cultured bacteria in glass dishes, convinced that one of them was the culprit. They named it Bacillus influenzae and fought it with vaccines that offered no protection. They did not yet understand that what they sought was smaller than any microscope could see. Doctors tried everything: isolation wards, fresh air hospitals, masks soaked in antiseptic, gallons of disinfectant poured onto city streets. The smell of carbolic acid became the smell of civilization, trying not to disappear. In rural America, towns posted guards on every road. Strangers were turned back at gunpoint. Newspapers published lists of rules: do not spit, do not shake hands, stay home. The United States Public Health Service printed leaflets urging citizens to cover their mouths when they coughed, the first global campaign for hygiene. But the advice came too late for millions. In the mining towns of Pennsylvania, entire families vanished within days. In the western states, the harvest rotted in the fields because there were no workers left to gather it. Europe suffered under the double weight of war and pestilence. In France, trains filled with soldiers returning from the front also carried the contagion deep into the countryside. Villages that had survived 4 years of shelling found themselves emptied by disease in a month. In Germany, where food was already scarce, the weakened population became easy prey. Doctors worked by candlelight, writing reports that read like allergies. The hospitals overflow. We have no beds, no nurses, no strength left. The virus seemed to prefer youth. Those between 20 and 40, the generation that should have rebuilt the world, died in the greatest numbers. Scientists would later call it a cytokine storm, the body's own immune defense turning lethal, but in 1918 there were no words for it. To the people who watched their children and siblings collapse, it was simply unfairness beyond reason. Every society developed its own rituals of endurance. In Canada and the American West, families left food on porches for neighbors who could no longer walk. In Italy, priests blessed entire streets from doorways rather than entering homes. In Japan, masks became so common that people felt naked without them. In Australia, the government created quarantine stations at every harbour and closed its borders entirely, the first time a nation had isolated itself from the rest of the world for survival. Through October and November, the disease reached its peak. Mortality curves rose like mountain ranges on charts pinned to hospital walls. In some cities, bodies outnumbered the living. Municipal governments collapsed under the weight of illness. Schools became hospitals. Theatres became morgues. The social order bent until it nearly broke. Yet amid the despair, there were small acts of courage that kept the fabric of humanity from tearing. Nurses who had survived the first infection returned to care for others, believing their own immunity made them invincible. Students organized soup kitchens. Orchestras played in empty concert halls and broadcast by radio to homes that could no longer gather. In the trenches of France, the guns finally fell silent on November 11th. The soldiers cheered, embracing, coughing, weeping. The war had ended, but the virus was still among them. In the weeks after the armistice, more soldiers died from influenza than from bullets in the final year of fighting. Victory parades turned into outbreaks. Governments that had censored the truth during the war now faced it in the open. Newspapers that once printed casualty lists from the front began printing casualty lists from every neighborhood. The figures blurred comprehension: tens of thousands. In one city, millions across continents. The words Spanish flu were now spoken with the same fear once reserved for the word plague. Doctors called it the most democratic disease because it touched everyone, rich and poor, king and farmer alike. By December, the Great Wave began to ebb, not because humanity had triumphed, but because the virus had exhausted its hosts. Those who survived carried scars in their lungs and in their memories. Entire families were gone. Streets were lined with vacant houses. The smell of disinfectant faded, replaced by the dull quiet of grief. People spoke of it less and less each day, as if silence could bury what history could not explain. When the year ended, the world tried to celebrate. Fireworks burst above cities still wearing masks. Church bells rang again, this time for hope. But underneath the noise lay a collective exhaustion unlike anything before. Civilization had faced an enemy too small to see and nearly lost. The war had changed maps. The influenza had changed humanity itself. In the months that followed, governments counted their dead and found that the numbers defied comprehension. No official total could capture the loss, for many regions had no one left to record it. Estimates would vary forever, but the truth was simple. More than 50 million lives had ended in less than a year. It was the greatest single catastrophe of the modern age. When spring finally returned in 1919, survivors stepped into the sunlight as if learning to live again. The masks came off, the schools reopened, and the newspapers turned to other stories. Yet beneath the relief was an unspoken fear that something so vast and unseen could one day return. They had learned that the world was smaller than they thought, and that distance no longer meant safety. The invisible enemy had receded, but it had not vanished. It lingered in memories, in laboratories, in the breath of those who had survived. The autumn of death was over, but the century it left behind would never be the same. By late 1918, the influenza had taught humanity a new vocabulary of fear. Words that had once seemed distant, quarantine, contagion, isolation, became part of everyday conversation. Governments issued edicts and health boards created rules that citizens had never encountered before. Public gatherings were banned, schools closed, theaters emptied, and the sound of laughter in the streets vanished. Cities became ghostly landscapes, where only the occasional cough or the bell tolling for the dead punctuated the silence. In many places, authorities tried to manage the chaos by enforcing masks. Simple strips of gauze tied over the mouth and nose became both shield and symbol. In San Francisco, every citizen over the age of 6 was required to wear one. Police patrolled the streets, issuing fines or arresting those who refused. Photographs, from the time show policemen in masks directing traffic, mothers walking children to school with faces wrapped in cloth, and shopkeepers behind counters hiding their expressions behind layers of fabric. The masks were imperfect, of course, but they gave a sense of control, a fragile illusion in a world that had lost its predictability. Public health campaigns were relentless. Pamphlets instructed citizens to cover their mouths when coughing or sneezing, to wash their hands frequently, and to avoid gatherings of any kind. Some cities placed handbills on doors with lists of symptoms: fever, headache, sore throat, cough, fatigue. Hospitals created isolation wards, and volunteers patrolled neighborhoods, searching for the sick who could not come to medical facilities. The message was clear: stay home or risk death. Yet the enforcement of these measures revealed the tension between authority and personal freedom. In many cities, citizens protested. In San Francisco, thousands gathered in defiance of mask ordinances, waving banners and shouting that the government had no right to tell them how to breathe. Some left their masks dangling uselessly around their necks. Others wore them incorrectly, exposing the nose and rendering the protection ineffective. Newspapers debated the issue openly, some defending the rules as necessary for public health, others portraying them as tyranny. The discussion itself revealed a society struggling to comprehend the scale of the threat. Inside hospitals, nurses and doctors worked under unimaginable pressure. By now, many medical professionals had already contracted the virus during the first and second waves. Exhaustion was universal. Those who survived continued their work, treating patients for hours with little rest, sometimes sleeping in the same rooms as the sick to be nearby if conditions worsened. Supplies were short. Medicines that might have relieved symptoms were largely ineffective. Masks, gloves and disinfectants were rationed, and hospitals improvised with whatever materials they could find. In some cities, schools and churches were converted into temporary treatment centers, their floors lined with cots and blankets for the overflow of patients. At the same time, public officials sought to control information as carefully as they controlled the disease itself. Wartime censorship was still in effect in many countries, and even after the armistice, governments feared that reporting the full scale of the epidemic would provoke panic. Newspapers that did report numbers often minimized them, using vague language like "influenza outbreaks continue" or "cases remain manageable." Families in affected areas knew otherwise. Letters describe entire neighborhoods stricken simultaneously, and local health records, often unpublished, showed death tolls far exceeding official reports. In New York, for instance, some boroughs recorded hundreds of deaths per day at the peak, numbers that were not fully reflected in national statistics. The social consequences of the pandemic were immediate and profound. Economic activity slowed sharply as workers fell ill or were forced to quarantine. Factories and shops closed temporarily. Deliveries of food and goods were disrupted. In some cities, relief efforts were organized by neighbors rather than government agencies, as official structures struggled to respond quickly enough. Public transportation slowed or stopped entirely when enough drivers and conductors became sick. In rural areas, communities faced the double burden of isolation and sickness, with farmers unable to tend fields or harvest crops, compounding the crisis. Education suffered as well. Schools closed in city after city to prevent the spread of disease. Teachers, often the first adults to contract influenza in a classroom setting, succumbed quickly, leaving classrooms empty. Children, isolated from friends and community, experienced the pandemic not only as a medical crisis, but also as a disruption to daily life and routine. Some children were left entirely without caregivers when parents fell ill, and neighbors often stepped in to provide care, though many became ill themselves. Despite the widespread use of masks, isolation measures, and public health campaigns, the influenza continued to spread. Cities that had enforced strict measures saw lower immediate mortality rates, but the virus could not be contained completely. Small towns and villages, initially spared, found the disease arriving months later with equal ferocity. In some cases, the spread followed transportation routes, with railways and ports acting as conduits for contagion. This pattern underscored the reality that in a connected world, local measures could delay but not prevent a pandemic. Social rituals adapted under the strain of the epidemic. Funerals were hastily organized, often without the presence of family members. Religious institutions held services outdoors or limited attendance to prevent gatherings. Weddings and public celebrations were postponed or cancelled entirely. Even simple acts of communication, visiting friends, attending markets or gathering for meals, became potential threats. Masks and distance redefined social etiquette almost overnight, reshaping human interaction in ways that would be remembered long after the virus receded. The psychological toll was immense. Fear permeated communities. Parents feared for children, children feared for parents. Neighbors distrusted one another, uncertain if any breath could carry death. Anxiety and grief became daily companions. Yet amid the fear, small acts of humanity persisted. Volunteers risked exposure to care for the sick. Neighbors shared food with quarantined households. Doctors and nurses continued working despite exhaustion. These efforts were not always enough to halt mortality, but they preserved the social fabric and offered glimpses of hope amid overwhelming loss. In some countries, the pandemic accelerated changes in public health infrastructure. Governments began establishing permanent organizations to monitor disease, improve sanitation, and coordinate responses. The use of masks, quarantine stations, and public education campaigns laid the foundation for modern epidemiology. Communities learned, often through tragedy, that coordinated action could mitigate the effects of an invisible enemy, even if it could not fully eliminate it. As the autumn wore on, the visible panic began to fade, replaced by the quiet endurance of the population. People adapted to masks, hand washing, and restrictions, and slowly returned to work. Hospitals began to empty, though the dead were still mourned in every community. The silence of the streets remained, punctuated by tolling bells and occasional coughs, reminders of the invisible enemy that had reshaped the rhythm of daily life. By the end of 1918, the first winter of the pandemic had passed. Governments, physicians, and citizens had all been tested. The crisis had revealed the fragility of human society in the face of a microscopic adversary. Masks and isolation had saved lives, but could not prevent suffering entirely. The influenza was still present, waiting for new hosts, but the lessons of public health were now etched into the collective memory. Communities emerged, cautious but resilient, determined to survive a world in which the smallest invisible organism had demonstrated the power to disrupt all aspects of life. The masks remained long after the worst of the disease had passed, not merely as tools of protection, but as symbols of a society forever altered. Silence, caution, and vigilance became part of the rhythm of human existence. The world had faced the invisible enemy, and though battered, had endured, carrying forward lessons that would shape future generations and the way humanity would confront the next pandemic. By the spring of 1919, the world had begun to breathe again, but the relief was fragile. The second winter of influenza had passed, and the death toll had slowed, yet the losses were impossible to tally fully. Entire families had vanished. Neighborhoods bore the silence of absence. Streets, once crowded with life, were now marked by empty houses, shuttered shops, and the faint odor of disinfectant that lingered long after the hospitals had emptied. Survivors walked among ghosts, each cough, each whisper, a reminder that the invisible enemy had not entirely gone. The influenza had reshaped the social landscape. Governments, overwhelmed during the crisis, had learned the limits of their authority and the fragility of public trust. Citizens had been forced to comply with unprecedented restrictions, from compulsory masks to strict quarantines. The experience had introduced a new understanding of collective vulnerability, and yet, almost immediately, society sought to forget. Newspapers that once chronicled the spread of disease shifted back to politics, economics, and the post-war reconstruction. The lives lost in the pandemic were reduced to statistics, quietly recorded in hospital ledgers and government archives, while the memory of the suffering faded from public consciousness. In scientific communities, the influenza left an indelible mark. Physicians and epidemiologists began to appreciate the need for systematic study of infectious diseases, the importance of hygiene, and the challenges of global coordination in public health. Laboratories around the world focused on isolating pathogens, developing vaccines, and understanding the mechanisms of contagion. Yet in 1919, they still lacked the tools to identify the virus precisely. The influenza remained a ghost in the microscope, a killer whose form eluded even the most diligent observers. Cities struggled to return to normal. Markets reopened, schools welcomed students, and trains resumed their schedules. Yet the shadows of the pandemic lingered. Workers were hesitant to return to crowded factories. Families mourned relatives who had no graves or whose burials had been rushed. Communities that had been isolated faced the challenge of reconnecting with the world, rebuilding economies, and restoring social bonds. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical. Survivors experienced fear, anxiety, and grief that would last a lifetime. Children who had lost parents, siblings, or entire neighborhoods grew up with awareness of mortality that shaped generations. In the United States, public health authorities reflected on their response. They recognized that early warnings had been ignored or suppressed in the name of wartime morale. Reports emphasized the need for transparency, community engagement, and preparation for future outbreaks. Lessons from Philadelphia, Boston, and other hard-hit cities informed subsequent policy. Yet the enormity of the catastrophe had already impressed itself upon the national consciousness in quiet, unspoken ways. Many Americans remembered not the headlines, but the fear, the silence of streets, and the persistent image of masked faces passing in crowded corridors. Globally, the impact was even more profound. In India, China, and Southeast Asia, mortality rates were staggering. In Europe, recovery from the war was compounded by the devastation of the virus. Countries with limited medical infrastructure faced famine and social disruption alongside disease. Entire villages had been decimated, leaving cultural, economic, and familial voids that could not be repaired quickly. Meanwhile, richer nations focused on recovery, public health infrastructure, and documenting the lessons of the epidemic, often overlooking the toll in the colonies or among marginalized populations. Despite the scale of the tragedy, the pandemic faded rapidly from popular memory. The influenza was overshadowed by the more immediate narratives of war, political upheaval, and reconstruction. Governments, eager to return to normalcy, downplayed the pandemic in official histories. Scientists continued to study it in academic journals, but public awareness dwindled. For decades, the 1918 influenza was remembered primarily by those who had lived through it, and even among survivors, the stories were often told quietly, if at all. The catastrophe became forgotten, not because it lacked significance, but because human societies instinctively prioritize moving forward. Historians in later generations would uncover staggering statistics. An estimated 50 million deaths. Worldwide, with some countries losing nearly 5% of their population in a single year. Cities had been emptied, farms abandoned, and social networks fractured. Yet, in 1919 and the years immediately following, the collective consciousness focused on rebuilding and forgetting, leaving the influenza as a whisper beneath the louder narratives of war, politics, and progress. The survivors carried scars in their bodies, in their homes, and in their communities. They remembered the masks, the quiet streets, the endless lines at hospitals, and the friends and family who vanished without trace. They carried the knowledge that a single invisible agent had the power to halt nations, challenge governments, and strike down the young and healthy. In small ways, this knowledge informed the evolution of public health, hygiene practices, and medical research. But the emotional weight of the experience, the horror and fear of living through the pandemic, became something largely private, a shared trauma that was rarely spoken of beyond family or local community. Yet the world had been changed forever. The influenza had revealed vulnerabilities in public health, governance, and societal cohesion. It had demonstrated the speed at which disease could travel in a connected world, foreshadowing challenges that would recur in the following century. The pandemic had also illuminated human resilience. Neighbors cared for one another, medical professionals risked their lives without recognition, and communities adapted to survive. In the decades that followed, the 1918 influenza pandemic became a cautionary tale referenced by medical scholars and epidemiologists, occasionally cited in historical analyses, but largely absent from public storytelling. Unlike wars or political revolutions, which left visible monuments, the pandemic left only statistics, diaries, photographs, and faint collective memory. It was a catastrophe that shaped humanity quietly, invisibly, leaving lessons in its wake that would only be fully understood by generations yet to come. The influenza of 1918 had traveled the world, taken millions of lives, and reshaped societies. It had demonstrated the fragility of human systems, the limitations of medical knowledge at the time, and the speed at which disease could exploit global connectivity. It had also shown the resilience, ingenuity, and compassion of those who survived. And yet, within years, it became a forgotten catastrophe, a silent shadow in the history books, waiting for the world to remember that sometimes the smallest, most invisible adversary can change everything. By the end of the decade, the streets were filled again with children's laughter and markets' bustle. Governments, medical institutions, and communities had learned new lessons about disease, prevention, and global vulnerability. The virus had receded into history, but its imprint on society, science, and the human imagination endured. A quiet reminder that even in victory, humanity must remain vigilant. And so the pandemic of 1918 became a ghost in the memory of the world, a catastrophe vast, deadly, and largely forgotten, yet one whose consequences continued to ripple across generations. Those who lived through it understood its lessons in ways that numbers could never convey, and for them, the masks, the silence and the fear would never fully disappear.